In the latter half of the 15th century, the edge of the known world for a European was a place of endings. It was the western coast of Portugal, where the rocky cliffs of Cabo de Roca drop sheer into the churning Atlantic, and where, for centuries, men had stood and watched the sun descend each evening into a vast, watery infinity. It was the wind-scoured shores of Ireland, where monks in isolated stone beehive huts on Skelligs heard only the crash of waves and the cries of gulls. It was the long, sandy beaches of Finisterre in Galicia, Spain, a name that literally and poetically means land's end, the very finish of the earth. Beyond that coast, beyond that final outpost of stone and soil, there was nothing but the ocean sea, the Mar Oceano. It was not a place on a map, it was an absence. It was a vast, uncharted, and terrifying expanse of water that stretched, as far as anyone knew, to the very edge of the world, where it presumably cascaded into an endless void. Sailors, in the smoky taverns of ports like Palos and Cadiz, told stories of this place. They were not tales of adventure, but of warnings. They spoke in hushed, fearful voices of monstrous serpents, serpientes marinas, with scales as dark as night and eyes like lanterns, that could coil around the largest ship and crush it like an eggshell. They whispered of sea dragons with gaping maws that could swallow a man whole in a single, silent gulp. They spoke of the Mare Tenebrosum, the Sea of Darkness, a cursed region where the water boiled and bubbled with subterranean fires, and where the wind died a permanent death, leaving ships trapped in a silent, stagnant, watery purgatory, their crews slowly perishing under a merciless, unmoving sun. The horizon, that clean blue line where the sea met the sky, was not just a line, it was a boundary, a psychological and spiritual wall, a warning etched into the very fabric of the world by God and nature, a command not to venture too far. To sail west was not just foolish, it was to invite divine punishment, to sail toward oblivion. But for one man, standing on that very coast, perhaps in the bustling Portuguese port of Lagos or the quieter shores of his native Genoa, the horizon was not a wall. It was a question. It was a persistent, gnawing, obsessive question that would come to define his entire existence. And his name was Cristoforo Colombo. Christopher Columbus. He was not, in the popular imagination, a rugged, weathered sailor, a man of the sea in the way of old salts who could smell a storm coming in their bones. He was the son of Domenico Colombo, a weaver of wool, and Susanna Fontanarosa, a weaver's wife. He grew up in the bustling, mercantile world of Genoa, a city of ships and ledgers, of wharves and counting houses. As a young man, he went to sea, yes, but he was not a simple deckhand. He was literate, observant, and ambitious. He became a skilled cartographer and a meticulous, voracious reader. He pored over the works of ancient geographers, devouring the Imago Mundi of Pierre d'Ailly, the travels of Marco Polo, and the letters of the classical scholar Pliny the Elder. He filled the margins of his books with notes, his own thoughts, his own calculations. He was a man who spent more time with books, with parchment, with the quiet, speculative world of ideas, than he did with a tiller in his hand or a line hauling a sail. He was, in many ways, a man of the library who dreamed of the sea, a scholar who longed to test his theories against the vast, unknown reality. And the idea that came to consume him, that burrowed into his mind and would not let go, was simple in its conception, yet, to the established wisdom of his time, deeply, profoundly flawed. He believed, correctly, that the world was a sphere. This was not a radical notion in the 15th century. Educated people, from university professors to royal cosmographers, largely accepted that the earth was round, a concept known since the time of the ancient Greeks. Eratosthenes had even calculated its circumference with remarkable accuracy over 1700 years before Columbus was born. The question was not the shape of the world, but its size. And this is where Columbus, in his quiet, book-lined world, made his fateful error. He had read the works of the ancient geographer Marinus of Tyre, and he had also studied the apocryphal book of Esdras in the Bible, which he interpreted to mean that the land mass of the earth was far larger than the water. He combined these sources with his own wishful thinking and arrived at a radical, and radically incorrect, conclusion. He believed the quickest, most direct route to the fabled riches of the East, the spices of the Indies, the silks and porcelains of Cathay, the gold and pearls of Cipangu, which was his name for Japan, was not the long, arduous, and dangerous land route eastward, through the war-torn lands of the Middle East and across the vast expanse of Asia. It was westward, straight out into that terrifying, monstrous, empty ocean sea. You would simply sail west, and you would eventually come up against the eastern shores of Asia. It was, in his mind, a simple, elegant solution, a shortcut to unimaginable wealth and glory. His problem was one of scale, a colossal miscalculation born of a mixture of poor data, religious conviction, and a desperate, driving ambition. He calculated the distance from the Canary Islands, the last known European outpost in the Atlantic, to the island of Cipangu, to be approximately 2,400 nautical miles. He was dramatically, historically, almost incomprehensibly wrong. The actual distance from the Canaries to Japan, following a straight line west, is closer to 10,600 nautical miles. He had underestimated the size of the Earth by about 25%, and he had vastly overestimated the eastward extension of Asia. The great ocean he proposed to cross was far, far larger, deeper, and more mysterious than he could ever have imagined. But he did not know that. He could not know that. And his profound, beautiful, and catastrophic miscalculation would become the engine for one of the most audacious, consequential, and world-altering voyages in all of human history. For years, he carried this idea with him. It was a secret he held close, a private map in his mind that no one else could see or comprehend. He became a familiar, and perhaps slightly pitiful, figure in the royal courts of Europe. He was a man on the outside, forever looking in, forever waiting in antechambers, forever unrolling his worn, hand-drawn charts on heavy oak tables before skeptical eyes. He would appear, dressed always in the simple, modest clothes of a pilgrim or a scholar, his hair having turned prematurely white from years of disappointment and wandering. He would speak with a quiet intensity, a fervor that bordered on the religious, explaining his plan, showing his calculations, pointing to the vast, empty space on the maps and claiming it was not empty at all, but a pathway to the greatest treasures on earth. He was a man possessed by a single, unshakable idea, and he spent the best years of his life trying to convince someone, anyone, to believe in it with him. He first went to King João II of Portugal, the monarch of the greatest seafaring nation in Europe, the country that was already pushing its way down the coast of Africa, seeking a route to the Indies around its southern tip. The king's committee of experts, his Junta dos Matemáticos, listened politely to the Italian stranger, examined his charts and his calculations, and found him to be wrong. They were not fools. They knew the true circumference of the earth far better than he did. They knew that the distance he proposed to sail was impossible with the ships and supplies of the day. They rejected his plan, gently but firmly. His own brother, Bartholomew, traveled to the court of King Henry VII of England to pitch the idea, with equal lack of success. In France, he was also turned away. For nearly a decade, Columbus followed the peripatetic Spanish court of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, his fortunes ebbing and flowing with the chaotic politics of the Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to drive the Moors from the Iberian Peninsula. He was a persistent ghost, a familiar face in the royal entourage as it moved from city to city, forever asking, forever waiting, forever being told to wait a little longer. He was a man living on the very margins of history, his grand, consuming ambition a private, heavy weight he carried with him from one dusty town to the next, a burden that no one else could see or share. Finally, in the cold, snowy winter of 1491, after yet another formal rejection by a royal council in the city of Santa Fe, a defeated Columbus packed his few belongings onto a mule and began the long, lonely ride away from Granada, the newly conquered Moorish capital. He was heading for the coast, intending to leave Spain forever and travel to France, to try his luck at the court of King Charles VIII one last, desperate time. He was a man who had given up. The dream, after so many years, was finally dying inside him. He was riding away from everything he had worked for, leaving behind the land that had given him hope and then taken it away. But as he rode, his mule trudging along a dusty, winter road, a royal messenger came thundering up behind him. The messenger called out his name. Columbus stopped, his heart surely pounding in his chest. The messenger had been sent by Queen Isabella herself. Persuaded at the very last moment by her loyal quartermaster, Luis de Santangel, who argued passionately for the relatively small investment and the potentially enormous reward, the Queen had had a profound change of heart. She had decided to take the gamble. Columbus was to return to the royal court at once. The Queen's decision was not born of any visionary belief in exploration or geography. It was a gamble, a relatively cheap and easy one, made in the fervent, triumphant, and slightly reckless atmosphere of a stunning military victory. The Spanish crown was flush with success and confidence after finally defeating the Moors and capturing Granada. The royal coffers were not overflowing, but the spirit of the moment was one of possibility. What was the cost of outfitting 3 small ships, compared to the potential reward? A new trade route to the Indies, a chance to spread Christianity to the heathen lands of the East, and the tantalizing possibility of beating the hated Portuguese to the source of the world's spice trade. It was a low-stakes bet on a high-risk, persistent, and oddly compelling dreamer. The terms Columbus then demanded were so astonishing, so audacious, that they reveal the very core of the man. He was not a humble sailor asking for a job, for a chance to prove himself. He was a visionary who had been scorned for a decade, and he was now demanding his full, glorious due. He asked to be made Admiral of the Ocean Sea, a title of immense prestige and power that would be hereditary, passing down to his sons and his sons' sons forever. He asked to be made the Viceroy and Governor-General of any and all lands he might discover, with absolute authority over them. And he asked for a permanent 10% share, the diezmo, of all the wealth, gold, silver, spices, pearls, gems, anything of value generated from those lands. He wanted, in essence, to become a grandee of Spain, a lord of whatever unknown world lay beyond the sunsets he had stared at for so long. He wanted to be not just an explorer, but a prince. And, in their moment of supreme triumph and with a casual shrug at the apparent absurdity of it all, Ferdinand and Isabella agreed. They had very little to lose, and they were, perhaps, a little in awe of this man's absolute, unwavering certainty. So, in the late spring of 1492, a man with a royal charter in his pocket and titles ringing in his ears traveled to the small, sleepy, salt-stained port of Palos de la Frontera, in the province of Huelva in southern Spain. He had his papers, he had his promises, and he had his dream. But he did not have ships. And, more critically, he did not have men. Palos was a town that knew the sea in its bones. It was not a grand, cosmopolitan port like Cadiz or Barcelona. It was a working port, a fishing and trading town, full of the sharp, honest smells of tar caulking the seams of boats, of salt cod drying in the sun, of old rope and chandlery, and of the muddy, tidal flats of the Rio Tinto. The men of Palos were not philosophers or dreamers. They were practical, weathered, hard-bitten men who knew the ocean sea as a place of honest danger and relentless, exhausting work. They fished its near shores, they traded along the coast of Africa, but they never, ever lost sight of land for more than a few days. To them, the deep ocean was a place to be avoided, not explored. When the royal decree arrived from the court, ordering the town to provide 2 caravels for this foreigner's insane voyage, the reaction was not patriotic fervor or adventurous excitement. It was a cold, silent dread. The local sailors, the marineros of Palos, wanted absolutely nothing to do with this Geno stranger. This Cristobal Colon, with his strange accent, his foreign books, and his impossible plan to sail west, into the setting sun, into the sea of darkness from which, everyone knew, there was no return. Columbus faced his first, and perhaps most formidable, obstacle: he could not find a crew. The royal order was a piece of paper, but compelling free men to sail to their presumed deaths was another matter entirely. The men of Palos would hide when they saw him approaching. They would suddenly fall ill with mysterious fevers. They would quietly slip out of town to visit relatives in the countryside. The port, once a place of steady, quiet industry, seemed to grow even quieter whenever the tall, white-haired foreigner walked along the docks, his eyes scanning the ships, his presence a grim omen. His salvation, his essential, indispensable partner in this enterprise, came in the form of the Pinzon brothers. Martín Alonso Pinzon and his younger brother, Vicente Yanez Pinzon, were the most respected shipowners and experienced mariners in the entire region. They were not just sailors, they were leaders of men, patrons of the sea, men whose judgment was trusted implicitly by the local sailors. Martín Alonso Pinzon, the elder, was a man of vision himself. He listened to Columbus, studied his charts, and made a decision that would change his life and history. He believed in the voyage. Or, perhaps more accurately, he believed in the potential for immense wealth and glory that the voyage promised. He threw his considerable weight, his fortune, and his reputation behind the enterprise. He helped Columbus find and lease 2 suitable caravels. He used his influence to recruit the frightened men of Palos, vouching for the voyage, calming their fears, and promising them a share of the riches to come. Without Martín Alonso Pinzon, Christopher Columbus would very likely have remained an obscure footnote, a persistent dreamer who died waiting on a dock in Palos. The ships themselves, once acquired, were not the grand, majestic vessels of legend and Hollywood. They were small, sturdy, working boats, built for the coastal trade, not for crossing an unknown ocean. The Nina and the Pinta were caravels, a Portuguese design renowned for their speed and maneuverability. They were light, shallow draft ships, perfect for exploring unknown coastlines and sailing close to the wind. The Santa Maria, which Columbus made his flagship, was a larger now, a heavier, slower ship, but still, by modern standards, astonishingly small. Imagine a wooden ship, the length of a modern bowling lane from the foul line to the head pin, about 60 feet long. Now imagine nearly 40 men living, sleeping, eating, and working on that tiny, cramped deck, along with livestock, firewood, water barrels, wine casks, salted meat, hardtack biscuits, and supplies for a voyage that could last a year. It was a wooden shell, a tiny, fragile, overcrowded bubble of human life, surrounded by an immensity of water so vast it could swallow continents without a trace. It was a world in miniature, adrift on an endless, alien planet. The crew that was finally assembled was a collection of the desperate, the daring, and the doomed. There were experienced sailors from Palos and the surrounding towns, men who signed on because the Pinzon brothers, men they trusted, were leading them. There were men looking for a fresh start, escaping unpaid debts, failed businesses, or troubled pasts, men for whom the unknown perils of the ocean seemed a better bet than the known perils of the law or the bailiff. There were criminals, granted amnesty by royal decree in exchange for signing on for the voyage, men with nothing left to lose. There was a royal official, Rodrigo de Escobedo, whose sole job was to serve as the official notary of the expedition, to document everything they found in the name of the crown, to give their discoveries the weight of law. There was a surgeon, a master-at-arms, and a translator who spoke Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic, languages Columbus thought would be useful when they reached the court of the Great Khan in China. They were a motley, mismatched group, a floating cross-section of late medieval Spanish society, united not by a shared vision of discovery, but by a shared vessel, a shared uncertainty, and a shared, deeply uncertain fate. In the pre-dawn darkness of August 3, 1492, they made their final, hushed preparations on the docks of Palos. The air was cool and perfectly still, the last stars still visible in the deep indigo sky. A quiet, anxious murmur hung over the shore, where small groups of women and children, mothers and fathers and wives, had gathered to watch. There were no cheers, no bands playing, no speeches. There was only the soft creak of rigging, the gentle bump of hulls against the docks, and the low, solemn sound of prayers being whispered. This was not a celebration. It was a farewell. It was a vigil. For the vast majority of these men, for the criminals, for the sailors, even for the Admiral himself, this was very likely a final parting. They were sailing into the unknown, and the unknown rarely gives back what it takes. As the first faint, gray hint of light began to touch the eastern sky, turning the black water to silver, the anchors were raised with a soft, rhythmic clanking. The sails, furled tightly against the masts, were loosed and began to fill with a faint, hesitant breeze, as if the very wind was unsure about following them. And the three small ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, turned their bows away from the known world, away from the coast of Spain, away from the last familiar sight of the church tower of Palos, and pointed them west, toward the dark, vast, and utterly unknowable horizon. They slipped out of the harbor and into the ocean sea, leaving behind the world they knew and sailing toward a world that did not yet exist in the mind of Europe. The first leg of the journey was, at least, familiar. They sailed south, following the well-known route to the Canary Islands, a Spanish possession off the coast of Africa. It was a last taste of home, a final, lingering connection to the world they had left behind. They spent nearly a month there, taking on fresh water, supplies, and making final, crucial repairs. On the Pinta, they discovered a leak in her rudder and fixed it. On Gomera, Columbus perhaps caught a final glimpse of a European woman, Beatriz de Bobadilla, before departing for good. On September 6, they raised anchor for the last time and left the island of Gomera behind, its volcanic peak slowly shrinking in their wake. For the men on the decks, watching that last known peak of land, that final, tangible piece of their world, sink slowly below the horizon behind them, it must have been a moment of profound, almost unbearable psychological transformation. It was one thing to be out of sight of land for a day or two, hugging the coast. It was quite another to watch it disappear entirely. To know that the last reminder of home was gone, that there was nothing behind them but the vast, empty sea they had just crossed, and nothing ahead of them but an even vaster, emptier sea they had yet to cross. The world behind them was gone. It had ceased to exist. There was only the world ahead, and the world ahead was nothing but water. The boundaries of their existence had shrunk to the wooden planks beneath their feet. The days began to blur into one another, losing their individuality, merging into a continuous, endless present. The crew settled into the ancient, hypnotic, and deeply repetitive rhythm of a long sea voyage. The sails required constant, meticulous attention, needing to be trimmed and adjusted with every subtle shift of the wind. The decks had to be scrubbed every morning, a ritual of maintenance that gave shape to the shapeless days. The ship's boy, the page, would turn the hourglass every half hour, marking the slow, granular passage of time with a quiet announcement, his voice a small, human punctuation in the vast silence. The only sounds were the ones made by the ship itself. The deep, rhythmic creak of the wooden timbers flexing against the pressure of the sea. The gentle flap and snap of the canvas sails. The hiss of the bow cutting through the water. And the endless, hushed, all-encompassing sound of the sea against the hull, a sound that was not a single noise but a constant, whispering presence, a living thing that breathed with the swell of the waves. It was a sound that would become a constant, inescapable companion, the background music to their profound isolation, a sound they would hear in their sleep and in their waking hours, a sound that would, over the long weeks, begin to seep into their dreams and their thoughts. For the first few days, they had company, of a sort. They spotted birds, large flocks of seabirds, which gave the men a surge of fragile hope, for birds, everyone knew, meant land was near. They followed the birds, but day after relentless day, the horizon remained a clean, sharp, empty line. The birds flew on, their calls fading into the distance, and the ships followed, but no land ever appeared. The sea itself began to change around them. They entered a vast, strange, and eerily beautiful region known today as the Sargasso Sea. The water became calm, almost glassy, and the surface was covered in great, floating mats of golden brown seaweed, a type of sargassum that stretched in all directions as far as the eye could see. It was beautiful, yes, but it was also deeply unsettling. The ship slowed as the wind became fitful and uncertain, barely a whisper. The men stared at the tangled, grasping weed, their imaginations working overtime. They remembered the old stories, the whispered warnings in the taverns of Palos, the tales of ships getting trapped in a sea of kelp, unable to move, their hulls slowly rotting as the crews died of thirst under a merciless, stationary sun. This was the first real test of their collective nerve, the first moment when the old fears rose up and confronted them with tangible form. But the weed did not trap them. It parted around the hulls, and after days of slow, anxious sailing, they passed through it, and the wind, thank God, returned. As the days turned into weeks, as September wore on and the calendar pages turned with no sign of land, a quiet, creeping dread began to settle over the little fleet like a cold fog. They had been sailing west, day after day, week after week, for much longer than anyone, even Columbus, had expected. The men were not fools. They could feel the time passing. They knew they were far, far from home. Columbus, understanding the fragility of his crew's morale better than anyone, made a decision that reveals the deep anxiety at the heart of his command. He began keeping two logs. There was the real log, the one he kept hidden in his cabin, the one that accurately recorded the true distance they had traveled each day, the true, terrifying magnitude of their journey into the unknown. And then there was the false log, the official one, the one he showed to the crew each evening. In this version, he consistently and deliberately underreported the distance they had sailed, making them believe they were hundreds of miles closer to home than they really were, making the empty ocean seem smaller, less infinite, less hopeless. This small, quiet deception is a window into the lonely, precarious mind of Columbus. He understood, with a cold, clear certainty, that he was not just commanding a fleet of ships. He was managing a fragile, collective human hope. He was the keeper of a flame that could be extinguished by a single wrong word, a single moment of shared panic, a single look of despair that spread from man to man. The entire enterprise, his entire life's work, could unravel in an instant into chaos, fear, and mutiny. So he lied to them, gently, quietly, every single day, to keep them sailing west. By the end of September, the men were growing visibly restless, their faces drawn and anxious. The wind, perversely, was behind them, a steady, reliable trade wind that pushed them further and further west, deeper and deeper into the unknown. It was a wind that promised an easy outward journey, but it also whispered a terrifying question: if the wind always blows west, how will we ever get back? The empty blue expanse, once just a backdrop, now seemed to press in on them. It began to play tricks on their weary minds. Several times a day, a man would let out a cry, a shout of land. Land, pointing at a dark smudge on the far edge of the world. The crews would scramble up the rigging, their hearts pounding with desperate hope, their eyes straining to see. Only to watch, with a crushing, soul-destroying disappointment, as the smudge slowly resolved itself into a low, gray rain squall on the horizon, or a trick of the light, a bank of clouds that looked, for one brief, glorious moment, like a mountain. Each false sighting was worse than the one before. It made the ocean feel even larger, even more empty, even more hostile. It made them feel not like bold explorers on a heroic quest, but like lost, foolish, doomed men, chasing phantoms across an endless, watery desert. The first real, open crisis came on October 6. Martín Alonso Pinzón, the experienced and respected captain of the Pinta, the man who had made the voyage possible, had finally had enough. He had been watching the birds, noting their flight patterns, and he had come to his own conclusion. He signaled to Columbus, using flags and perhaps shouting across the water, that they should change course. The due west route, he argued, was getting them nowhere. It was a path to oblivion. He believed they should swing to the southwest, following the flight of the many birds they saw, birds that, in his experience, flew toward land at evening to roost. Columbus, standing on the high stern castle of the Santa Maria, refused. He was the Admiral. He had been given his titles by the Queen herself. He, and he alone, would determine the course of this voyage. The fleet would continue due west. It would follow his map, his vision, his command. He was stubborn, yes, but it was a stubbornness born of absolute conviction, of a decade of believing in something that no one else believed in. To change course now would be to admit doubt, and doubt was a luxury he could not afford. But the seeds of a deeper discord were now well and truly planted, and not just with the proud Pinzón. The grumbling among the common sailors, the marineros, grew louder and less careful. They no longer spoke only in hushed tones, in small, furtive knots gathered near the bow, away from the officers. They spoke openly now, in the evening, of the endless sea, of the wind that only blew one way, of the Admiral's folly. They whispered about the stories their grandfathers had told them, stories that were now proving true. They spoke of the Sea of Darkness, and they began to wonder if they would ever see the green hills of Spain again. The mood on the three small ships grew heavy, thick with a low, simmering, dangerous tension. By October 9, the situation had become genuinely desperate. The men were teetering on the very edge of control. They had been out of sight of land for over a month, 33 days of nothing but water and sky. For men of the 15th century, whose entire world was bounded by the horizon, this was an eternity, an experience so far outside the normal human experience that it was akin to sailing off the edge of the earth. Some of the more desperate sailors began to talk openly, in low, dangerous voices, of a solution. They spoke of throwing Columbus overboard, pushing him into the sea one dark night and claiming he had fallen overboard by accident. Then, they could turn the ships around. They could sail east, with the wind at their backs, and go home. They could still make it, they argued. The wind that had carried them west would carry them east. It was not too late. They could still survive. Columbus, standing apart, watching the faces of his men, was acutely, painfully aware of the mortal danger he was in. He was one man, a foreigner, outnumbered nearly 40 to 1, alone in the middle of an ocean he had promised would be small, surrounded by frightened, desperate men who saw him as the author of their doom. He was the keeper of a dream that was turning into a nightmare. He did what leaders in impossible situations have always done. He gathered the men, perhaps on the deck of the Santa Maria, and he spoke to them. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He spoke with a quiet, intense, desperate conviction. He reminded them of the glory that awaited them, of the riches that were just over the horizon, of the honor they would receive from their queen and their God. He appealed to their pride, to their greed, to their faith. And then, he made a promise. It was a final, desperate gamble, the last card he had to play. He asked them to give him just 3 more days. Just 3. If they did not see land in 3 days, if the horizon remained empty for 72 more hours, he would give the order to turn back. He would admit defeat. He would save their lives. He gave them a deadline, a light at the end of the tunnel of their fear, a specific, measurable end to their suffering. It was just enough. It was enough to calm the immediate, explosive threat, to buy him a little more time, to push the mutiny off for just a little while longer. But the hourglass, the great, cosmic hourglass of the Voyage, was now truly, visibly running out. The sand was falling, and everyone on those 3 tiny ships was watching it fall. The next day, October 10th, the tension on board was so thick it was a physical presence, a weight pressing down on every man. Every single sailor, from the lowliest ship's boy to the officers, spent every waking moment scanning the horizon. Every floating branch, every patch of unfamiliar seaweed, every bird that flew overhead, was examined with a desperate, aching hope. The day passed, slowly, agonizingly, each hour feeling like a day. Nothing. That night, the men slept fitfully, if at all, their dreams filled with images of endless, gray water, of drowning, of home. October 11th dawned, clear and beautiful, the second of the 3 days Columbus had promised. The wind was strong and favorable, pushing them west at a good speed. But still, the horizon remained a clean, sharp, mocking line between the blue of the sea and the paler blue of the sky. The men grew quieter as the day wore on. They stopped talking. They stopped hoping. They were waiting, not with expectation, but with a kind of numb, resigned acceptance. They were already mentally preparing themselves for the long, humiliating, and probably impossible journey home. They were beginning to grieve for themselves. But late that afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon they were forbidden to cross, everything began to change. The signs, long absent, began to multiply with an almost supernatural speed. A green reed, not dried and dead, but looking freshly cut, as if from a riverbank, floated gracefully past the hull of the Pinta. A shout went up from the Nina as a sailor spotted a small branch, still covered in red berries, looking fresh and vibrant, clearly not from the sea. Then, the most powerful sign of all, a carved stick, a small piece of wood that had been shaped, unmistakably, by human hands, was pulled from the water. It was not a natural object. It was a tool, an artifact, a message from a world beyond their own. These were not tricks of the light. They were not phantoms. They were real, solid, tangible objects from a world that existed, that had to exist, just over that still empty horizon. Hope, a wild, electric, almost unbearable hope, began to surge through the 3 ships, spreading from man to man like a fever. They were close. They had to be close. The ocean was finally giving up its secret. As darkness fell on October 11th, the men could barely contain themselves. They strained their eyes into the gathering gloom, staring at the western horizon with an intensity that was almost painful. Knowing that somewhere out there, just beyond the range of their vision, just beyond the reach of the fading light, was the answer to their months of fear, the answer to the ancient question of what lay beyond the sunset. At around 10 o'clock that night, under a brilliant canopy of stars, Columbus himself, standing alone on the high poop deck of the Santa Maria, staring into the darkness, thought he saw something. It was faint, flickering, unsteady, like a small candle, a wavering point of light, seen for a moment and then gone, appearing and disappearing in the far, impenetrable distance. He called to Pedro Gutierrez, a court official, who also strained his eyes and thought he saw it too. But it was gone in an instant, lost in the darkness, and no one else on the ship could confirm it. It might have been a figment of an exhausted, hopeful mind, a trick of tired eyes after weeks of staring at nothing. But for Columbus, it was a sign. It was a confirmation. He was sure of it. Land was out there. Then, at 2 o'clock in the morning on October 12, 1492, the Pinta, being the fastest ship, was sailing a little ahead of the others. A common sailor named Rodrigo de Triana was standing his watch, looking out into the moonlit darkness, when he saw it. It was not a flicker. It was not a trick. It was a solid, unmoving shape, a pale cliff, a white sand dune, gleaming in the soft light of the moon. He stared for a moment, his heart seizing in his chest, unable to believe what he was seeing. And then, he let out a cry that shattered the profound, 4-week silence of the deep ocean. He let out a cry that would echo down through the centuries. Asterisk tierra. Tierra, asterisk land. Land. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The cry was taken up by other men. Bells were rung. Men ran to the rails, weeping, laughing, shouting prayers of thanks. The relief was so profound, so absolute, so overwhelming, that it must have felt like a physical force, a wave washing over them and washing away the fear, the doubt, the anger, the despair of the past weeks. The tension of an entire month, the fear of death, the corrosive whispers of mutiny, all of it dissolved in an instant, replaced by a wild, almost delirious joy. The ships hove to immediately, dropping their anchors into the unknown depths, and waited for the dawn. They were less than 2 miles from a shore that none of them, not the Admiral, not the Pinzones, not the lowliest sailor, had ever seen or imagined. They had sailed west, further west than any European in recorded history, and they had found something. They did not know what it was. They did not know if it was an island, a continent, or the gates of paradise itself. But it was land. It was solid, permanent, real. It was the end of the beginning of their journey, and the beginning of something else entirely. The morning of October 12, 1492, dawned slowly, beautifully, over a small island in the Bahamas, an island the native people, the Lucayans, called Guanahani. The air that came off the land was warm and soft, carrying the sweet, intoxicating scent of unfamiliar flowers and trees, a perfume that was the very breath of a new world. The water between the ships and the long, curving white sand beach was so astonishingly clear that they could see the sandy bottom, dotted with colorful fish, as if they were floating in air. It was a scene of such profound peace, such untouched beauty, that it must have seemed like a vision, a glimpse of Eden, to the men who had spent so long on the gray, monotonous, threatening sea. It was a gift, a reward for their faith. Columbus prepared himself with the solemnity of a priest approaching an altar. He went below and put on his finest clothes, a splendid outfit of scarlet, the color of royalty and of the blood of Christ, worn over his armor, the uniform of an admiral of the ocean sea. He took the royal banner of Castile and Aragon, the green and gold flag of his sovereigns, in his hands. Then, with a contingent of armed men, he climbed down into a small boat and was rowed slowly, ceremonially, toward the shore. The only sounds were the dip of the oars in the crystal water and the distant calls of unknown birds from the island. As the bow of the boat grated softly on the white sand, Columbus stepped out. He was the first European, in this moment, to set foot on this shore. He fell to his knees. According to his own detailed account, written later that day, he wept. He gave thanks to God, aloud, for the mercy and the glory of this moment. He had done it. He had crossed the ocean sea. He had found the land on the other side. He rose, and with great solemnity, he named the island San Salvador, Holy Savior, in honor of the Holy Trinity and of the salvation they had found. He unfurled the royal banner, and with his officers and men kneeling around him, he took formal, legal possession of this island, and by extension, of all the lands he might discover, in the name of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. His voice, speaking the formal words of dominion, was the first European voice to officially, legally claim a piece of this vast, ancient, and utterly unknown continent. And then, as he finished the ceremony and looked up, he saw them. Emerging from the treeline, watching him and his men with an expression of pure, unadulterated curiosity and wonder, were the people who had lived on this island for centuries, for millennia. They were the Lucayans, a branch of the Taino people. They were naked, as the climate allowed, their skin painted in bright colors made from berries and clay. They had no weapons, no knowledge of the iron and steel the Spaniards carried. They approached slowly, timidly, offering gifts of their own, parrots and balls of cotton thread, as a gesture of peace and welcome. To Columbus, writing in his journal that night, they were instantly and definitively Indians, Los Indios, because he was absolutely, unshakably certain that he had reached the Indies, the fabled eastern edge of Asia. He described them in his journal with a mix of wonder and a chilling, clinical detachment. They were, he wrote, a gentle people, guileless and naive, with beautiful bodies and open faces. They would, he noted, make good and skilled servants. They would be easy to convert to our holy faith, he added, with a small gesture of the hand. He saw them not as a people with their own history, stretching back into a past as deep as his own, with their own gods, their own complex social structures, their own sacred claim to this island and this life. He saw them as part of the landscape he had just claimed, another natural resource to be noted, catalogued, and, in time, exploited. They were the first human evidence of his success, the first living proof that his dream was real. He spent the next few days in a state of intense, joyful exploration of this first island, San Salvador. He noted the lush vegetation, the strange new fruits, the parrots with their brilliant plumage, the houses of the natives, which he called huts. He was given small pieces of gold, worn as ornaments in the noses of the natives, and his questions about where this gold came from were met with gestures toward the south. So, he sailed on, ever searching for the source of the gold, for the great cities of Asia he was sure were just over the next horizon. He discovered island after island, each one more beautiful than the last, and he gave them all new, Christian names, Santa Maria de la Concepcion, Fernandina, Isabella. He sailed south, and on October 28, he reached the northeastern coast of a massive island he would name Juana, in honor of Prince Juan. This was Cuba. He was convinced, absolutely convinced, that this was not an island, but the mainland of Asia, the coast of Cathay, the great empire of China. He sent a small embassy inland, with the translator who spoke Hebrew and Arabic, to find the great Khan and his fabled cities. They found nothing but small villages of thatched huts and more gentle, fearful people. They returned with reports of a plant the natives rolled up and smoked, which they called tobacco, but no palaces, no gold, no great Khan. Columbus, however, was not deterred. He simply concluded that they had not gone far enough inland. He continued to sail. He then sailed east, following the coast of Cuba, and then across a narrow strait to a vast, mountainous island he named La Isla Española, Hispaniola, Little Spain. Here, on December 5, the landscape was even more spectacular than anything they had yet seen. The mountains were green and majestic, the rivers clear and cold, rushing down from the high peaks. The harbors were deep and safe. And here, finally, he saw the first real glimmers of the gold he so desperately sought. The natives here wore larger, more elaborate gold ornaments. They spoke of a place in the interior called Cebu, which Columbus's eager ears immediately transformed into Cipangu, Japan. He was certain he was on the very doorstep of the island of gold. The dream, for one brief, shining moment, seemed to be coming true. But the voyage, for all its wonders, was not without its costs. The men were exhausted, the ships were weary, and the strain of command was taking its toll. On the night of December 24, Christmas Eve, a terrible, avoidable tragedy occurred. The helmsman on the Santa Maria, against the explicit orders of Columbus, left a ship's boy in charge of the tiller and went to sleep. The boy, inexperienced and probably exhausted himself, let the ship drift onto a coral reef off the coast of Hispaniola. The hull was torn open. Despite desperate efforts to save her, the Santa Maria was a total loss. The flagship of the expedition, the vessel that had carried the Admiral across the unknown ocean, lay broken on the reef, slowly filling with water. It was a disaster that could have destroyed the entire enterprise. But Columbus, ever the improviser, saw an opportunity in the wreckage. He ordered the men to strip the ship of its timbers, its supplies, its guns. Using the wood from the Santa Maria, they built a small fort on the shore, the first European settlement in the Americas since the Vikings had tried and failed 5 centuries before. He named it La Navidad, Christmas, in honor of the day the ship was lost. He left 39 men there, volunteers, with instructions to trade with the natives, to learn their language, and above all, to find the gold of Cebu. He left them with supplies for a year, with seeds to plant, and with the authority to establish a trading post in the name of Spain. And on January 4, 1493, he boarded the Nina, the smallest of his ships, and with the Pinta now under the command of the somewhat estranged Martin Alonso Pinzon, he began the long, daunting journey home. He left behind a tiny, fragile enclave of European men, alone in a world they did not understand, surrounded by people they were already beginning to treat with a mixture of condescension and casual cruelty. It was a seed planted in the soil of a new world, a seed that would grow into something vast and terrible. The return voyage was brutal, far worse than the outward journey. The winter storms of the North Atlantic were fierce and unrelenting. The 2 ships, the Nina and the Pinta, were separated in a howling tempest, each one alone on the monstrous sea. Columbus, on the Nina, faced towering waves, mountains of black water that crashed over the deck, and screaming winds that tore at the sails. The little ship was tossed like a child's toy. He was so certain, so absolutely convinced, that he was going to die, that he performed a final, desperate act. He went below to his small cabin and, by the light of a flickering lantern, wrote an abbreviated account of his discovery on a piece of parchment. He summarized the voyage, the islands, the people, the gold. He sealed the parchment in a waxed cloth, then placed it inside a wooden barrel, which he then cocked shut to make it as watertight as possible. He brought the barrel on deck, and in the midst of the screaming storm, he threw it overboard, into the churning, merciless sea. He prayed that it would someday wash ashore somewhere, anywhere, and tell the world what he had found, even if his own body was lost forever in the deep. That barrel was never found. It drifted away into the vastness of the ocean, a message in a bottle from a dying admiral, a ghost story lost to the waves. But he did not die. The storm, as suddenly as it had arisen, abated. The little Nina, battered and leaking, survived. The storms pushed the ship east, far off its intended course, and on March 4, a little over 2 months after leaving La Navidad, the Nina limped into the mouth of the Tagus River and dropped anchor in the port of Lisbon, Portugal. It was an awkward, dangerous place to be. He was in the capital of his greatest rival. He had to go ashore and explain himself to King João II, the very monarch who had rejected his plan years before, the king who had told him it was impossible. But now, Columbus came not as a beggar, not as a persistent, slightly annoying dreamer. He came as a man who had done the impossible. He was invited to the royal court, and he dined with the king. He showed him drawings of the new lands. He showed him the strange, colorful parrots he had brought back, birds that did not exist in any European menagerie. And he showed him a few of the miserable, sick, and frightened natives he had brought back as living proof of his discovery. He sat at the table of the king who had rejected him, and he told him stories of a world the king's own experts had said could not exist. It must have been a sweet, profound, and deeply satisfying moment. Finally, after a brief delay, he sailed again for Spain. On March 15, 1493, the Nina, followed shortly by the Pinta, which had also survived the storms and made its own way back, sailed into the harbor of Palos de la Frontera, the very same port from which they had departed, amidst such fear and reluctance, 7.5 months before. The return was the mirror image of the departure. He was greeted not as a failed dreamer, but as a living hero, a man returned from the dead. The streets of Palos filled with people, pouring out of their houses to catch a glimpse of the ships and the men. Church bells rang out across the town, a joyful, deafening peal of celebration. He marched in a slow, triumphal procession from Palos to Barcelona, where the royal court was in residence. Crowds lined the roads to see him pass. When he finally entered the great hall of the royal palace in Barcelona, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella rose from their thrones to greet him, an unprecedented honor. They ordered him to sit in their presence, to be seated as an equal. He displayed, one by one, the treasures he had brought back, the strange, colorful birds, whose feathers shimmered in the light. Plants and seeds of species never seen before in Europe, masks and ornaments of hammered gold, crude but undeniably real, and the 7 surviving natives, now dressed in European clothes and baptized with Christian names. He spoke to them, in his quiet, intense voice, of green islands and blue seas, of gentle people who lived in a perpetual golden age, of rivers that ran with gold and trees that smelled of paradise. He was given a new, elaborate coat of arms, a heraldic confirmation of his titles. He was now, truly, unquestionably, the Admiral of the Ocean Sea, the Viceroy of the Indies. He dined with royalty. He was the most celebrated, the most famous man in all of Europe. Kings and queens sought his company. Poets wrote verses in his honor. He had achieved everything he had ever dreamed of, and more. And yet, in that moment of supreme, dazzling triumph, the full, earth-shattering truth of what he had actually done was not yet understood, not by him, not by the king and queen, not by anyone. He was celebrated, he was honored, he was rewarded, because he was believed to have found a new, shorter, easier route to the fabled, limitless riches of Asia. The news of his voyage spread across Europe like wildfire, carried by letters and printed pamphlets that were devoured by an eager public. Maps were hastily redrawn, with new islands and coastlines added to the far west of the Atlantic. The old horizon, the ancient boundary, had been shattered forever. The world had, in a single, breathtaking instant, effectively doubled in size. But the land he had found was not the eastern edge of Asia. It was not the gateway to the spices of India or the silks of China. It was something far larger, far stranger, far more profound. It was a place that would come to be called, only much later, after years of exploration and dawning realization, the New World. Christopher Columbus himself, the man who had crossed the ocean and back, never fully grasped the true, cosmic magnitude of his own revelation. He would make 3 more voyages across the Atlantic, each one larger and more heavily armed than the last. He would explore the coasts of Cuba and Jamaica, he would sail along the coast of South America and see the mighty outflow of the Orinoco River, fresh water in the middle of the ocean, a sure sign of a continental land mass of enormous size. He would deduce, correctly, that he was near a continent, a terra firme of vast proportions. But he could not, he would not, let go of the original idea that had consumed his life. He died on May 20, 1506, in a modest house in Valladolid, Spain, still convinced, to his very last breath, that he had reached the outskirts of Asia, that Cuba was a peninsula of China, that Hispaniola was near Japan. He died in relative obscurity, his titles stripped of much of their meaning, his reputation tarnished by the chaos and violence that had marked his later governorship of the very lands he had found. He died without knowing, without ever suspecting, that he had stumbled upon an entire hemisphere, a world that had been unknown to his own for 10,000 years. The revelation of the New World was not a single, blinding flash of discovery. It was not a moment. It was a slow, gradual, and deeply unsettling dawning of comprehension that unfolded over years, over decades, across the entire continent of Europe. It began with that first, tentative step onto a white sand beach, a step taken by a man who thought he was in Asia. It was the first meeting of 2 worlds. The old and the new, that had been separated by an ocean and by millennia of separate history, 2 streams of humanity that had diverged at the dawn of time and were now, suddenly, violently, flowing back together. It continued with the men he left behind at La Navidad, every single one of whom would be found dead, killed by the very people they had been taught to see as gentle servants, by the time Columbus returned on his second voyage. It grew with the voyages of others, of men like Amerigo Vespucci, a Florentine merchant with a keen and skeptical mind, who sailed along the coast of South America and realized, with a shock, that this was not Asia. This was a new continent, a mundus novus, a new world, a land mass that the ancients had never known, that Ptolemy had never mapped, that the Bible had never mentioned. And it was Vespucci's letters, widely printed and read across Europe, that led a German cartographer, Martin Waldseemüller, to suggest, in 1507, that this new land should be named, in honor of the man who had recognized its true nature, America. It was a revelation that came with a profound, incalculable, and enduring cost. The gentle, curious people Columbus first encountered, the Lucayans of the Bahamas, first Americans to greet the Europeans, were gone within a single generation. They were wiped out, utterly and completely, by a combination of European diseases to which they had no immunity, by the brutal violence of enslavement and forced labor, and by the sheer, soul-crushing despair of a world turned upside down. The encounter that Columbus began was not a meeting of equals, a dialogue between 2 branches of the human family. It was the start of something far more complicated. A story of conquest and exploitation, of immense cultural exchange and unimaginable tragedy, a story of wonder and grief intertwined, that would reshape the entire planet, its peoples, its ecosystems, and its history, forever. And it all began with a single man, a weaver's son from Genoa, a man of books and dreams, a man of profound faith and profound error, who looked at the western horizon and refused, absolutely refused, to see it as an end. He saw it as a beginning. He saw a door where everyone else saw a wall. He gathered his fragile ships and his frightened men, and he crossed the ocean sea. And in crossing it, he did not just discover a new land. He closed one world forever, the world of the medieval, the bounded, the known. And he opened another, the world of the modern, the global, the interconnected, a world whose horizons, for everyone who came after, would never, ever look quite the same again. He opened a door that could never be closed. And we are still, all of us, living in the world that lay on the other side.